I'm Marcus Bennett, and the night my cousin Trevor called me a loser at Chris's wedding reception, I had no idea the next 10 minutes would rewrite every assumption my family had built about me over 30 years. The champagne glasses were clinking, the string quartet was playing something soft and elegant, and I was standing near the dessert table trying to make myself invisible when Trevor found me. His words cut through the celebratory noise like a blade through silk, meant to wound, designed to remind me exactly where I stood in the Bennett family hierarchy. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the bride's father had been trying to reach me for weeks. And when Gregory Hartwell walked across that polished marble floor with his hand extended and those 5 words left his mouth, everything my family believed about success, worth, and who deserved respect shattered like crystal hitting concrete. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Belltown loft, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where I'd been working for the past 6 hours. Seattle stretched out below me, the Space Needle rising in the distance, ferries cutting white lines across Elliott Bay. This view had cost me everything I had 5 years ago, but it represented something more than real estate. It was proof that I'd built something real, something solid, even if the people who shared my last name had no idea it existed. My laptop screen glowed with the latest portfolio analysis, 17 companies across 6 industries, each one handpicked, funded, and guided by the firm I'd founded from nothing. Bennett Capital Partners had become one of the most selective venture capital operations in the Pacific Northwest, known not just for identifying promising startups, but for placing the right executive talent at exactly the right moment. We didn't just invest money, we invested leadership. And that distinction had made all the difference. My phone buzzed against the wooden surface, the vibration breaking my concentration. A text from my mother appeared on the screen, her words carrying that particular tone of forced cheerfulness that always preceded family obligations. Christopher's wedding is 3 weeks away. Your father and I assume you'll be attending. Please confirm so we can finalize the seating arrangements. I stared at those words longer than necessary, feeling the familiar weight settle in my chest. Christopher was Trevor's younger brother, the golden child who'd followed every expected path, checked every traditional box, made every choice that earned approving nods at Bennett family gatherings. His engagement to Jessica Hartwell had been celebrated like a corporate merger, 2 suitable families joining forces, connections strengthening, social standing elevating. I'd received the formal invitation 6 months ago, my name printed in elegant script on cream-colored cardstock that probably cost more per square inch than most people's wedding gifts. But in all the family group chats, all the planning discussions, all the excited phone calls about venues and flower arrangements and menu selections, my presence had been treated as an afterthought, a checkbox to mark for completion's sake. I typed a simple response confirming I'd attend, then set the phone down and returned to the spreadsheet in front of me. Numbers didn't carry subtext. Financial projections didn't require me to decode hidden meanings or navigate the unspoken hierarchy of family dynamics. Here, in this space I'd carved out for myself, success was measurable, achievement was quantifiable, and worth wasn't determined by how well you performed at Sunday dinners or whether you'd chosen the right graduate school or married into the right family. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my relatives gathered for holidays and dissected my life choices over expensive wine, cataloging my failures and shaking their heads at my unconventional path, I was building something they couldn't begin to comprehend. After graduating from University of Washington with a degree in economics, I'd taken a position at a mid-sized investment firm where I'd quickly realized that traditional finance wasn't interested in innovation. They wanted safe bets, proven models, established patterns. I wanted to find the ideas that would reshape industries. So I'd left, scraped together seed capital from 3 brave investors who believed in my vision, and launched Bennett Capital Partners from a shared office space in Pioneer Square with nothing but a business plan and an absolute refusal to play it safe. The first 2 years had nearly broken me. Long stretches where I lived on ramen and black coffee, where every pitch meeting felt like begging, where my family's skepticism felt like a physical weight pressing down on every decision. My father had made his disappointment clear over a tense dinner at their Bellevue home, his voice carrying that particular sharpness he reserved for what he considered poor judgment. You had a stable position, Marcus. Benefits. A clear career trajectory. This venture capital fantasy is exactly that, a fantasy. You're gambling with your future while your cousins are building real careers. I'd absorbed those words in silence, offered no defense, made no argument. What could I say that would penetrate the conviction that success only looked one way, followed one path, produced one specific type of outcome? So I'd stopped trying to explain. Stopped sharing updates about the firm's progress. Stopped hoping they might ask questions or show interest or acknowledge that maybe possibly I knew what I was doing. The silence had grown over years, thickening into an impenetrable barrier where my professional life existed in a completely separate dimension from my family life. They knew I worked in finance, some vague understanding that I did something with investments, but the specifics remained mysterious because I'd learned that sharing them only invited judgment, comparison, or thinly veiled suggestions that it still wasn't too late to pursue something more conventional. 3 years ago, everything had shifted. We'd placed a CEO at a struggling biotech startup that had developed promising cancer treatment protocols, but lacked the leadership to navigate FDA approval processes and scale production. The executive we brought in had pharmaceutical experience, regulatory expertise, and the vision to see past the immediate obstacles to the company's genuine potential. Within 18 months, they'd secured approval, partnered with 3 major hospital networks, and quintupled their valuation. Bennett Capital Partners' stake in that company alone had generated returns that eclipsed what most traditional investment firms made in 5 years. But I hadn't told my family. Hadn't mentioned it at Thanksgiving when Trevor was holding court about his promotion to senior associate at his law firm. Hadn't brought it up at Christmas when my Aunt Carol was praising her daughter's acceptance to medical school. Hadn't shared it during the spring gathering when everyone was discussing Christopher's engagement and the Hartwell family's impressive connections. What would have been the point? They'd already decided who I was in their narrative. The risky one. The unconventional one. The one who'd strayed from the approved Bennett family path, and would probably regret it eventually. My phone buzzed again, this time with an email notification. The subject line made my pulse quicken slightly. Fortune magazine interview request regarding your inclusion in their 40 under 40 finance innovators list. I opened the message and scanned the details. They wanted to feature Bennett Capital Partners' unique approach to executive placement and venture funding, highlighting how we disrupted traditional investment models by treating leadership as the primary asset rather than an afterthought. The interview was scheduled for next week, and they'd already confirmed the list would be published in their September issue, hitting newsstands 2 weeks before Christopher's wedding. I closed the laptop and walked to the window, pressing my palm against the cool glass. This kind of recognition would make everything public. Not just my success, but the scale of it. The Fortune list wasn't some minor industry publication. It was mainstream visibility, the kind of exposure that reached far beyond finance circles into general public awareness. My family would see it. Not through me telling them, but through other people mentioning it, through colleagues and friends and distant acquaintances sending congratulations, through the unavoidable spread of information in the digital age where privacy was a quaint concept and achievements were broadcast whether you wanted them to be or not. Part of me felt relief. The secret I'd been carrying, this parallel life I'd built in silence, would finally emerge not through my own announcement but through external validation that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. Another part of me felt dread, knowing that this revelation wouldn't land as celebration within my family, but as disruption, complication, something that required management and explanation and probably resentment. The Seattle skyline blurred slightly as the sun dropped toward the Olympics, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost artificial in their intensity. I'd chosen this city specifically because it wasn't where I'd grown up, wasn't saturated with family history and childhood memories, and the weight of expectations I could never quite meet. Here, I'd been able to construct an identity based entirely on what I'd built rather than what I'd inherited or who I was related to or which boxes I'd checked on the approved life path checklist. Tomorrow I'd meet with James Patterson, my business partner and the only person outside my professional circle, who understood the full scope of what Bennett Capital Partners had become. We'd discuss the Fortune interview, strategize about the publicity, plan for the inevitable questions and attention. But tonight, standing in this space I'd created, looking out at a city that had given me the anonymity to become exactly who I was meant to be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth I'd been avoiding. Everything was about to change, and there was no controlling how my family would respond when they finally understood what they'd been dismissing all these years. The next morning arrived with typical Seattle weather, clouds hanging low and heavy, threatening rain that might or might not materialize. I dressed carefully for my meeting with James, choosing a navy suit that struck the right balance between professional authority and understated confidence. Our offices were located in South Lake Union, occupying the entire third floor of a modern building that housed several successful tech companies and offered views of Lake Union that our clients found appropriately impressive without being ostentatious. Rachel Kim, our director of executive placement, was already at her desk when I arrived, her workspace organized with the meticulous precision that made her exceptional at matching leadership talent with company needs. She glanced up as I passed, offering a knowing smile. Saw the Fortune email. "Congratulations, Marcus. This is going to change everything." I nodded, not trusting myself to articulate the complicated mixture of pride and apprehension churning in my chest. James was in the conference room, reviewing portfolios spread across the glass table. His reading glasses perched on his nose in that absent-minded way that made him look more like a professor than a venture capitalist. He'd been the first person to believe in my vision, the first investor willing to bet on an unproven model, and over 5 years he'd become not just a business partner but the closest thing I had to family who actually understood what I'd built. We spent 2 hours discussing strategy, analyzing which aspects of our approach to emphasize in the Fortune interview, debating how much to reveal about our current portfolio and future plans. James advocated for complete transparency, arguing that our success spoke for itself, and there was no benefit to false modesty. I found myself hesitating, old habits of privacy and self-protection rising instinctively to the surface. Eventually we compromised on an approach that would be honest about our achievements, while maintaining some strategic discretion about specific companies and upcoming deals. As the meeting concluded and James gathered his materials, he paused at the door and fixed me with a direct look that carried years of friendship and professional respect. "Marcus, whatever complicated feelings you have about your family seeing this, remember something. You didn't build Bennett Capital Partners for their approval. You built it despite their lack of it. That's a far more impressive achievement." His words settled into the silence after he left, echoing in the empty conference room like a truth I'd known but never quite articulated. The Fortune interview took place the following Tuesday in a coffee shop near Pike Place Market, the journalist arriving with a recorder and a list of questions that revealed she'd done thorough research. We talked for 90 minutes about my approach to venture capital, the philosophy behind treating executive placement as the primary value add rather than just capital injection, the companies we transformed through strategic leadership changes. She asked about my background, my education, what had driven me to start the firm. I gave her the professional version of my story, the narrative scrubbed clean of family disappointment and personal doubt, presenting a trajectory that sounded inevitable, rather than hard one. When she asked if I came from an entrepreneurial family, I hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering that I'd chosen my own path. It was technically true, even if it omitted the context that made that choice feel less like freedom and more like necessity. The article would run in 3 weeks, she told me as we concluded, and they'd send advance copies for fact-checking. I thanked her and walked back to the office through streets crowded with tourists and local workers, the familiar smell of salt water and coffee mixing in the air, feeling like I'd just set something irreversible in motion. The Fortune magazine arrived at my loft on a Thursday afternoon, delivered in a plain manila envelope that felt heavier than it should. I set it on my kitchen counter and stared at it for a full minute before opening it, knowing that once I broke that seal, there was no returning to the anonymity I'd maintained for so long. The glossy cover featured a tech entrepreneur I vaguely recognized, but when I flipped to the table of contents, there it was in clean sans serif type. Finance's New Guard, page 47. My hands remained steady as I turned to the article, but my heartbeat accelerated in a way that felt disproportionate to the simple act of reading words about myself. The piece opened with a photograph they'd taken during our second meeting, me standing in our conference room with Lake Union visible through the windows behind me, arms crossed, expression serious but not severe. The caption read, "Marcus Bennett, 32, founder of Bennett Capital Partners, has redefined venture capital by placing leadership before capital." The article itself was thorough and generous, detailing our approach with the kind of specificity that made it clear the journalist had understood not just what we did but why it mattered. She'd included quotes from CEOs we'd placed, testimonials from company founders whose struggling startups had transformed into industry leaders under the guidance of executives we'd identified and recruited. The numbers were there too, impossible to dismiss or downplay. Portfolio companies with combined valuations exceeding $2 billion, average returns that outpaced traditional venture capital firms by significant margins, a track record of successful exits that had generated substantial wealth for our investors and ourselves. Near the end of the piece, she'd written a paragraph that made something tighten in my chest. Bennett operates with a quietness that borders on secrecy, avoiding the self-promotion that characterizes much of the venture capital world. Those who know him describe a person driven not by ego but by a genuine belief that the right leader in the right position at the right moment can reshape entire industries. It's a philosophy that has proven remarkably lucrative, but more importantly remarkably effective. When asked about his own success, Bennett deflects, preferring to discuss the achievements of the companies and executives he's supported. It's a humility that feels increasingly rare in an industry not known for modesty. I read the article 3 times, each pass revealing new details I'd somehow missed, new implications of what this public exposure would mean. My phone had been unusually quiet all morning, which meant the magazine hadn't hit newsstands yet, hadn't begun its inevitable circulation through the networks and circles where my family moved. But it would. Probably by tomorrow, certainly by this weekend. The news would spread the way all news spread in the digital age, through forwarded links and social media shares and text messages with screenshots attached. I imagine my mother opening her email to find a message from a friend, probably someone they'd known for decades, someone whose opinion carried weight in their social sphere. Did you see that Marcus was featured in Fortune? I had no idea he'd accomplished so much. My father would receive similar messages from his golf partners, from colleagues at the architectural firm where he'd worked for 30 years, from various people whose awareness of my success would force him to confront the fact that he'd been catastrophically wrong about the path I'd chosen. The thought brought no satisfaction, just a hollow awareness that vindication through external sources felt emptier than I'd imagined it would. I left the magazine on the counter and returned to my desk, trying to focus on the work that actually mattered. We had a potential deal closing next week, a sustainable energy startup that needed a COO with manufacturing experience and international supply chain expertise. Rachel had identified 3 candidates, and I needed to review their backgrounds before our Monday meeting. But concentration proved elusive, my mind drifting back to the magazine, to the impending shift in how my family would perceive me, to the wedding that was now just 2 weeks away. Christopher's wedding had taken on a different weight in my mind, no longer just another family obligation, but a convergence point where my 2 separate lives would collide in ways I couldn't predict or control. I knew Trevor would be there, playing his usual role of family success story, the one who'd followed the correct path, made the approved choices, earned the validation that came from meeting every Bennett family expectation. I knew my parents would be there, proud and beaming over Christopher's marriage into the well-connected Hartwell family, showing off their acceptable son to a crowd of people who measured worth in traditional metrics of status and respectability. What I didn't know was how they'd treat me once the Fortune article had circulated, once my success was public knowledge that couldn't be ignored or minimized. Would they embrace it? Claim pride in an achievement they'd never supported? Would they resent it, viewing my visibility as somehow overshadowing Christopher's moment? Would they simply ignore it, maintaining the same careful distance they'd kept for years, pretending my professional life existed in a dimension entirely separate from family gatherings? The uncertainty bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I'd convinced myself over the years that I didn't need their approval, that I'd built my success specifically to prove that their validation was irrelevant to my worth. But the approaching wedding forced me to acknowledge a truth I'd been avoiding. Some part of me still wanted them to see me clearly, to understand what I'd accomplished, to recognize that the unconventional path they'd dismissed had led somewhere remarkable. It was a weakness, this residual need for family acknowledgement, and I resented it even as I felt it pulse beneath my carefully constructed indifference. My phone finally broke its silence late that afternoon, vibrating with a call from my mother. I considered letting it go to voicemail, buying myself a few more hours of peace before the inevitable conversation, but avoidance had never been my style. I answered on the third ring, keeping my voice neutral. Her greeting came rushed and slightly breathless, as if she'd been hurrying. "Marcus, I just received the most surprising email from Margaret Henderson. She sent me a link to a Fortune magazine article. About you." I waited, offering no response, curious to hear how she'd frame this. She continued after a pause that stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable. "I had no idea you'd achieved such success with your firm. The article makes it sound quite impressive." Her tone carried a strange mixture of pride and confusion, as if she couldn't quite reconcile the person described in the magazine with the son she thought she knew. I kept my response simple, offering no elaboration or explanation. "The firm has done well. We've built something solid over the past 5 years." My mother made a soft sound that might have been approval or surprise. "Your father will be quite interested to read this. Several of his colleagues have already mentioned it." She paused again, and I could hear her mental recalibration happening in real time. "We're looking forward to seeing you at Christopher's wedding. Perhaps we could arrange dinner beforehand? You could tell us more about your work." The invitation landed with the weight of an obligation rather than genuine interest, but I accepted it anyway, knowing that refusing would only create more tension. We set a date for the Thursday before the wedding, at a restaurant in Bellevue that my parents favored, the kind of place where the menu didn't list prices and the clientele spoke in hushed tones about real estate and investment portfolios. After we ended the call, I sat in the gathering twilight of my loft, watching the city lights begin their nightly emergence across Seattle's landscape. The conversation had been exactly what I'd expected, my mother's surprise revealing just how little attention she'd paid to my life over the years, her sudden interest appearing only after external validation had made my success impossible to dismiss. It should have felt like victory, this forced acknowledgement, but instead it felt like confirmation that their pride was conditional, dependent on public recognition rather than genuine understanding of who I was or what I'd built. The following days brought a steady stream of messages and emails, congratulations from colleagues and clients, interview requests from financial publications, invitations to speak at industry conferences. Bennett Capital Partners had been known and respected within venture capital circles for years, but the Fortune feature had pushed us into broader visibility, the kind of mainstream awareness that changed how people perceived the firm and by extension how they perceived me. James found the whole thing amusing, joking that we'd need to hire additional staff just to handle the increased interest from entrepreneurs seeking funding. Rachel pointed out more seriously that this visibility would make recruiting executive talent significantly easier, since proven leaders were more willing to trust their careers to a firm with public credibility. Both observations were accurate, but they didn't address the personal implications of exposure, the way my carefully separated worlds were merging whether I wanted them to or not. Christopher called 4 days before the wedding, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised me. "Marcus, I just wanted to reach out personally. I saw the Fortune article and I'm really proud of what you've accomplished. I know we haven't been particularly close over the years, but I hope you know I've always respected that you chose your own path." His sincerity caught me off guard, reminding me that not everyone in my family had treated my choices with skepticism or disappointment. Christopher had always been quieter than Trevor, less concerned with family hierarchy and social positioning, more focused on his own life than on judging others for theirs. I thanked him genuinely, and we talked for a few minutes about the wedding, about his fiancée Jessica, about his hope that the weather would cooperate for their outdoor ceremony. Before we ended the call, he added something that shifted my perception of the upcoming event. "Jessica's father specifically asked if you'd be attending. Apparently he's been following Bennett Capital Partners for a while. He's quite interested in meeting you." The comment landed strangely, carrying implications I didn't fully understand. Gregory Hartwell was a successful businessman, the founder of a regional manufacturing company that produced industrial components for aerospace and defense contractors. I knew the basics from wedding-related conversations, but I'd never imagined he'd have any awareness of my work or interest in meeting me. The dinner with my parents arrived with the inevitability of a scheduled medical procedure, something to endure rather than enjoy. I drove across Lake Washington to Bellevue as the sun set, the familiar route triggering old memories of growing up in this area, of the pressure to excel in specific predetermined ways, of the constant subtle messaging that success looked one way and one way only. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a building near downtown Bellevue, its interior decorated in dark woods and soft lighting that suggested refinement and expense. My parents were already seated when I arrived, my father rising to shake my hand with a formality that matched the surroundings, my mother offering a careful embrace that felt more performative than affectionate. We ordered drinks and made small talk about the wedding preparations, about Christopher and Jessica's honeymoon plans, about various relatives who would be attending. The conversation stayed surface level until our entrees arrived, at which point my father cleared his throat in the particular way that signaled a shift to serious topics. Marcus, I want to acknowledge that I may have been premature in my assessment of your career choice. The Fortune article presents a picture of success that I hadn't fully appreciated. His admission came stiffly, the words clearly difficult for him to speak, pride and discomfort competing in his expression. I appreciated the effort even as I recognized how inadequate it felt. This grudging acknowledgement arriving only after public validation had made my success undeniable. My mother added her own thoughts, talking about how surprised their friends had been, how many people had reached out with congratulations, how they were looking forward to introducing me properly at the wedding. The subtext was clear. My achievement had value primarily in how it reflected on them, how it elevated their social standing, how it gave them something to discuss with peers who measured success in precisely these terms. I listened and nodded and provided minimal responses, finding it difficult to summon enthusiasm for their belated recognition. When my father asked about the specifics of how venture capital worked, about our investment strategy and portfolio companies, I gave him a condensed explanation that skimmed the surface without diving into the complexity of what we actually did. He listened with the focused attention of someone hearing unfamiliar information, occasionally asking questions that revealed how little he understood about my professional world. The dinner concluded with plans to see each other at the wedding, with my mother extracting a promise that I'd sit with them during the ceremony, with my father mentioning that several people were hoping to speak with me at the reception. I drove back to Seattle feeling drained rather than satisfied, the evening having confirmed what I'd suspected. Their interest in my success was real, but it was interest in the external markers of achievement rather than genuine curiosity about the work itself or pride in the path I'd chosen. The distinction mattered more than I wanted to admit. That night I stood at my window overlooking Seattle, the magazine still sitting on my kitchen counter where I'd left it, and allowed myself to acknowledge a truth I'd been avoiding. The Fortune article hadn't changed anything fundamental about my relationship with my family. It had simply forced them to recalibrate their narrative, to incorporate my success into their understanding of who I was. But the underlying dynamic remained the same. I existed at the periphery of their world, valued conditionally, understood superficially, and only truly visible when external validation made me impossible to ignore. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, unusual for Seattle in September, but perfect for an outdoor ceremony. I dressed carefully in a charcoal suit, choosing a tie that Jessica had mentioned preferring in one of our brief conversations, checking my appearance with the same attention to detail I brought to important business meetings. The drive to the venue took 40 minutes, traffic lighter than expected on a Saturday afternoon, giving me time to mentally prepare for the convergence of family obligation and potential awkwardness. The Edgewater Hotel sat at the edge of Elliott Bay, its distinctive architecture and waterfront location making it one of Seattle's most recognizable landmarks. Christopher and Jessica had reserved the entire pier for their ceremony and reception, white chairs arranged in neat rows facing the water, an arbor decorated with late summer flowers positioned where the Olympic Mountains provided a dramatic backdrop. Guests were already arriving as I pulled into the parking area, well-dressed people moving in small groups toward the ceremony space, their voices carrying excitement and celebration across the warm afternoon air. I recognized relatives immediately, aunts and uncles I saw once or twice a year, cousins I'd grown up with but rarely spoke to anymore. The extended Bennett family network assembled to witness Christopher's marriage into a family they considered appropriately prestigious. My presence drew immediate attention, people approaching with congratulations about the Fortune article, with questions about my firm, with comments about how impressive it was that I'd built such success. The attention felt surreal after years of being largely ignored at family gatherings, as if I'd suddenly become visible in a way I hadn't been before. I responded politely to each interaction, offering brief explanations and modest deflections, uncomfortable with the spotlight but recognizing that avoiding it would create more awkwardness than simply accepting it gracefully. My mother found me near the seating area, guiding me toward the chair she'd reserved in the third row, close enough to signal family importance but not so close as to suggest I was part of the immediate wedding party. She introduced me to several people I didn't know, each introduction now including a reference to the Fortune article or my venture capital firm, my success having become her conversational currency in a way that felt both validating and hollow. The ceremony began precisely on time. String quartet playing processional music as the wedding party made their entrance. Jessica looked radiant in a simple, elegant gown, Christopher beside her looking genuinely happy in a way that softened something in my chest. Whatever complicated feelings I had about my family, I was glad for my cousin, glad he'd found someone who made him look that content, glad his path had led somewhere that suited him even if mine had required a completely different direction. The officiant spoke about commitment and partnership, about building a life together through understanding and mutual support, words that sounded idealistic but sincere. I found my attention drifting during the readings, looking out at the water where ferries crossed back and forth, thinking about the Fortune article and the dinner with my parents and the strange sensation of being seen by people who'd looked past me for years. When the ceremony concluded and guests began moving toward the reception area, I hung back slightly, letting the crowd flow past me, in no hurry to plunge into the social obligations that awaited. The reception hall had been transformed into something elegant and romantic, round tables dressed in white linens, centerpieces of flowers and candles, soft lighting that made the space feel intimate despite its size. A band was setting up in the corner, their equipment suggesting they'd provide more than simple background music. Servers circulated with champagne and appetizers, the bar was already drawing a small crowd, and the energy in the room held that particular excitement of a celebration just beginning. I located my assigned table near the edge of the space, far enough from the head table to confirm my peripheral status in the family hierarchy. The place cards indicated I'd be sitting with distant relatives and family friends, people I barely knew, a seating arrangement that made clear I wasn't considered part of the inner circle despite the recent Fortune article. I claimed my seat and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server, settling in to observe the gathering unfold with the detachment of someone who'd learned long ago that family events were something to survive rather than enjoy. Trevor found me 20 minutes into the cocktail hour, his approach carrying the aggressive confidence of someone who'd had several drinks and felt empowered by the social setting. He'd put on weight since I'd last seen him, his expensive suit straining slightly across his midsection, his face flushed with alcohol and self-satisfaction. "Marcus," he said loudly, drawing attention from nearby tables. "Glad you could make it. I wasn't sure you'd show up, given how busy you must be with your little investment hobby." The words landed with deliberate edge, designed to diminish, calculated to remind everyone within earshot that he still considered himself superior despite whatever article might have appeared in some magazine. Met his gaze steadily, keeping my expression neutral. "Good to see you too, Trevor. Congratulations on your brother's wedding." He waved off the comment, leaning against the back of an empty chair with false casualness. "Yeah, Christopher did well for himself. The Hartwells are an excellent family. Very well connected. Jessica's father runs that manufacturing company. Very successful operation. The kind of real business that generates actual value, not just moving money around and hoping something sticks." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with the contempt he'd never bothered to disguise. Several people at nearby tables had turned to watch our interaction, their conversations pausing as they sensed tension developing. I took a slow sip of champagne, letting the moment stretch before responding. "Investment isn't about hope, Trevor. It's about analysis, pattern recognition, and understanding which leadership teams can execute on promising ideas. But I wouldn't expect you to understand the nuances." He straightened slightly, his jaw tightening at the implication that his understanding might be limited. That's rich coming from someone who gambled their career on startups and got lucky a few times. Real professionals build their success through institutions, through proven paths, not by chasing trends and pretending to be important. The insult was clumsy but effective, designed to cut at the exact insecurity he assumed I carried. Around us, the attention had intensified, more guests pausing their conversations to observe what was clearly becoming a confrontation rather than casual family banter. Trevor's voice rose slightly, emboldened by his audience and the alcohol warming his system. "You know what's funny, Marcus? You show up here after years of barely participating in family events, Suddenly everyone's supposed to be impressed because some magazine wrote a few paragraphs about you. But let's be honest about what you actually are. You're a loser who got lucky, who's riding a temporary wave of success that'll crash eventually. And when it does, you'll come crawling back to the family you've been too proud to stay connected with. The word loser cut through the ambient noise of the reception like a knife through fabric, sharp and unmistakable. Conversations at surrounding tables stopped entirely now, all attention focused on the two of us, the crowd sensing that something significant was happening. My cousin's face was flushed darker now, a mixture of alcohol and anger and something else, perhaps insecurity masked as aggression, perhaps genuine resentment that I'd achieved recognition he felt should belong only to those who followed approved paths. I set my champagne glass down carefully on the table, taking a moment to control the surge of anger rising in my chest. Years of dismissal, of subtle and not so subtle put-downs, of being treated as the family disappointment crystallized into this single moment. When I spoke, my voice was quiet but carried clearly in the sudden silence. Trevor, I've spent the better part of a decade building something real, while you've been coasting on a law degree and your father's connections. If that makes me a loser in your assessment, I'm comfortable with your judgment. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a voice cut through from behind me, calm and authoritative. I think you might want to reconsider that assessment, son. I turned to find Gregory Hartwell standing a few feet away. His posture relaxed but his expression serious. He was in his early 60s, gray hair perfectly styled, wearing a suit that spoke of quality without ostentation. His presence commanded immediate attention, conversations stopping as people recognized the bride's father stepping into what had been a private family dispute. Trevor's face shifted rapidly through several emotions, surprise and confusion and sudden wariness, as he realized he'd been overheard by precisely the person whose good opinion mattered most today. Mr. Hartwell, I was just having a conversation with my cousin. We have a history of ribbing each other. It's all in good fun. Gregory Hartwell smiled slightly, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. I've been in business long enough to recognize the difference between good-natured ribbing and genuine contempt. What I just heard sounded distinctly like the latter. He turned his attention to me, extending his hand. Marcus Bennett, I presume? I've been hoping to meet you all evening. I shook his hand, feeling the firm grip of someone accustomed to evaluating people through physical contact. The pleasure's mine, Mr. Hartwell. Congratulations on your daughter's marriage. She and Christopher seem very happy together. He nodded, still holding my hand for a moment longer than a simple greeting required. They do, and I'm grateful for that. But I'm equally grateful for the opportunity to finally speak with you in person. I've been following Bennett Capital Partners' work for quite some time now. The statement landed like a small explosion in the space around us, drawing sharp attention from everyone within earshot. Trevor's expression froze somewhere between confusion and alarm, clearly trying to understand how the bride's father knew anything about my firm or why he'd been following its work. Gregory Hartwell released my hand and gestured toward the bar area. Would you mind walking with me for a moment? I'd like to discuss something that might interest you. I nodded, aware of every eye in the vicinity tracking our movement as we walked away from the tables toward a quieter corner of the reception hall. Behind us, I could hear the sudden burst of whispered conversations, speculation and surprise rippling through the gathered guests. Trevor remained standing where we'd left him, looking simultaneously furious and bewildered, his public dismissal of me having backfired in the most spectacular way possible. We reached a spot near the windows overlooking Elliott Bay, far enough from the main gathering that our conversation could remain private. Gregory Hartwell accepted a glass of scotch from a passing server and took a measured sip before speaking. I want to start by apologizing if I'm overstepping by involving myself in what appeared to be a family matter. However, I couldn't let your cousin's characterization stand unchallenged, particularly given what I know about your actual achievements. I appreciate that, though it wasn't necessary. Trevor and I have a complicated history. Family dynamics are rarely simple. He smiled at that, a genuine expression this time. That's certainly true. But let me be direct about why I wanted to speak with you. Hartwell Manufacturing has been watching the venture capital landscape carefully for the past 2 years. We're at a point where expansion requires not just capital but strategic guidance, particularly in identifying the right leadership for our planned aerospace division. Your firm's approach to executive placement has caught our attention. Specifically, the revelation shifted the entire context of our conversation, transforming what I'd assumed was polite interest into a potential business discussion. I kept my expression neutral, years of negotiations having taught me not to show surprise or premature enthusiasm. Bennett Capital Partners works primarily with earlier stage companies, though we've handled several growth stage investments. What scale of expansion are you considering? He outlined the basics of Hartwell Manufacturing's situation, describing a successful regional company that had reached the limitations of its current leadership structure. They needed a president for the new aerospace division, someone with industry experience, military contracting knowledge, and the vision to build something substantial from their existing capabilities. The position represented a significant opportunity for the right executive, but finding that person required exactly the kind of strategic talent identification that Bennett Capital Partners had become known for. As he spoke, I felt the familiar analytical machinery in my mind engaging, sorting through my mental database of executives and leaders, considering who might fit the profile he was describing. This was my element, the place where years of experience and carefully cultivated instincts came together to solve complex human capital problems. I've been trying to reach you for the past 6 weeks, Gregory continued, his tone carrying mild frustration. Your office is remarkably difficult to penetrate. I left 3 messages with your assistant, sent 2 emails that may have been filtered into spam, and was beginning to think I'd need to show up at your office building with a written invitation. The admission surprised me, though it shouldn't have. Rachel screened our inquiries carefully, protecting my time from the constant stream of requests and pitches that arrived daily. A message from a regional manufacturing CEO wouldn't have automatically triggered her attention, particularly without context suggesting it was a serious opportunity rather than another entrepreneur seeking funding. I apologize for that. We filter heavily to maintain focus on our existing portfolio. If you're willing to send me the detailed requirements for the position, I can review them properly and determine if we have candidates who might fit. He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to me, the simple cardstock bearing his contact information without excessive decoration. I'll send everything Monday morning, but I wanted to meet you in person first to get a sense of whether this might be a productive conversation. Your reputation suggests you're selective about the engagements you take on. That's accurate. We work best when there's genuine alignment between what a company needs and what we can provide. Parachuting executives into situations without proper fit rarely produces good outcomes for anyone involved. He nodded approvingly, taking another sip of his scotch. That's exactly the kind of thinking that attracted me to your firm in the first place. Too many placement operations focus on volume, on making matches quickly regardless of quality. You seem to operate with a different philosophy. We talked for another 15 minutes about approaches to executive recruitment, about the challenges of scaling manufacturing operations, about the specific demands of aerospace contracting. Gregory Hartwell revealed himself to be someone who understood business with genuine depth, who asked intelligent questions and listened carefully to answers, who treated our conversation as a meeting between equals rather than as supplicant seeking favor. When we finally returned to the main reception area, the cocktail hour was transitioning into dinner service, guests finding their assigned tables as servers prepared to bring out the first course. Gregory excused himself to return to the head table where his family was seated, but not before making one final comment that carried across the space clearly enough for nearby tables to hear. Marcus, I look forward to continuing this conversation next week. And for what it's worth, anyone who's built what you've built over the past 5 years is the exact opposite of a loser. He's someone who understood their own worth and had the courage to prove it despite skepticism from people who should have known better. The words landed with devastating precision, a public rebuke of Trevor's earlier assessment delivered by the one person at this wedding whose opinion carried undeniable weight. I returned to my assigned table to find the other guests staring at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to something approaching awe. The woman seated to my left, a friend of my aunt's whose name I'd already forgotten, leaned over immediately. What was that about? Gregory Hartwell just spent 20 minutes talking with you like you were the most important person at this reception. I deflected with a vague response about business matters, unwilling to discuss the details of a potential engagement that hadn't been finalized. But around the table, I could see the recalibration happening. these distant relatives and family friends suddenly viewing me through a completely different lens. The Fortune article had established my success in abstract terms, words on a page describing achievements they couldn't fully evaluate. But Gregory Hartwell's public attention had translated that success into concrete social capital they could understand and measure. Dinner proceeded with carefully orchestrated elegance, courses arriving at precise intervals, toasts delivered by Christopher's best man and Jessica's maid of honor, the bride and groom making their rounds to greet guests at each table. When they reached ours, Christopher embraced me warmly, thanking me for attending, while Jessica surprised me with genuine enthusiasm about the potential business connection with her father. "He's been talking about reaching out to you for weeks," she said, her smile bright and unguarded. "I think he's more excited about this wedding because it gave him an excuse to finally meet you than because he's gaining a son-in-law." Christopher laughed at that, clearly unoffended, secure enough in himself not to feel threatened by his new father-in-law's professional interests. After they moved on to the next table, I found myself relaxing slightly, the tension of the earlier confrontation with Trevor beginning to ease as wine and food and ambient celebration worked their subtle magic. The band started playing as dinner concluded, couples moving to the dance floor for the traditional first dances and subsequent open dancing. I remained at my table, content to observe rather than participate, nursing a glass of red wine, and watching the celebration unfold with the detachment of someone who existed at the edges rather than the center. My parents appeared briefly, my mother asking if everything was all right after my conversation with Gregory Hartwell, my father mentioning that several people had asked him about my firm. Their attention felt performative, motivated by the reflected status my sudden visibility had provided rather than genuine concern or interest. I answered their questions politely and watched them drift back into the crowd, relieved when they left me alone again. Trevor remained conspicuously absent from my vicinity for the rest of the evening, though I caught sight of him several times across the reception hall, his posture stiff and his expression dark. The public humiliation of his loser comment being immediately contradicted by Gregory Hartwell had clearly affected him deeply, undermining the confident superiority he typically wore like armor at family gatherings. Part of me felt satisfaction at his discomfort, a petty vindication for years of dismissive comments and subtle put-downs. But a larger part of me simply felt tired, exhausted by the emotional labor of navigating family dynamics, of maintaining composure in the face of contempt, of proving worth to people who should have recognized it without external validation. As the evening wore toward its conclusion, guests beginning to depart in small groups, I found myself standing near the windows again, looking out at the darkened bay where fairy lights traced paths across black water. The reception had been everything I'd anticipated and more, the convergence of my separate worlds producing exactly the kind of awkwardness and revelation I'd feared. But it had also clarified something important. My family's recognition of my success would always be conditional, dependent on external markers they could understand and measure, rooted in how my achievements reflected on them, rather than genuine pride in the path I'd chosen. That realization should have hurt more than it did, but instead it brought a strange clarity, a permission to stop seeking their approval and to simply exist on my own terms. Gregory Hartwell found me one final time before leaving, his wife Diana beside him, both of them preparing to head home after a long day of celebration. "I wanted to thank you again for your graciousness this evening," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "and to reiterate that I'm serious about the conversation regarding our aerospace division. I think there's real potential for collaboration." I assured him I'd review the materials he sent and respond thoughtfully, appreciating his directness and the respect he'd shown throughout our interactions. After he left, I remained at the window for a few more minutes, finishing the last of my wine, allowing the noise of the reception to fade into background texture. When I finally left the hotel and walked to my car, the night air was cool and clean, carrying the salt smell of the bay and the distant sound of the city that had become my real home. The drive back to Seattle felt longer than usual, traffic minimal at this late hour, the familiar route giving me time to process everything that had happened. Trevor's public insult, Gregory Hartwell's intervention, the revelation of a potential business opportunity, the strange mixture of vindication and emptiness that came from finally being seen by people who'd ignored me for years. None of it had unfolded the way I'd imagined, but all of it had confirmed what I'd suspected. My worth had never been in question except to people whose opinions ultimately didn't matter. The real validation had come years ago, in the quiet accumulation of successful investments, in the executives I'd placed who'd transformed struggling companies, in the portfolio returns that spoke louder than any magazine article or public confrontation. Everything else was just noise, the inevitable social theater that accompanied any public success. When I reached my loft, the city spread out below in its familiar pattern of lights and shadows. I felt a weight I'd been carrying for months finally lifting. The Fortune article, the wedding, the exposure of my hidden achievements, all of it had been building toward this moment of understanding. I didn't need my family's approval because I'd already proven everything that mattered to myself. Their recognition was pleasant when offered genuinely, as Christopher had done, but ultimately irrelevant to my sense of worth or direction. I changed out of my suit and stood at the window in darkness, letting Seattle's ambient light paint the room in soft gradients, feeling more centered than I had in weeks. My phone buzzed with a message from James, who'd somehow heard about the wedding reception confrontation through the mysterious networks that connected Seattle's business community. "Trevor called you a loser, and then the bride's father publicly praised you for 20 minutes? Please tell me someone recorded this because it sounds like the most perfect karma I've ever heard of." I smiled at the message, appreciating his irreverent take on what had been an emotionally complicated evening. No recording, just witnesses. And yes, the irony was not lost on anyone present. He responded immediately with a string of laughing emojis followed by a more serious question. "Did Hartwell really offer you a potential engagement? Because if so, that's a legitimate opportunity. Hartwell Manufacturing has excellent fundamentals and strong growth potential." I confirmed the basics of what Gregory had proposed, promising to share details once I'd reviewed the formal materials he'd send Monday. James's enthusiasm was palpable even through text messages, his business instincts immediately recognizing the opportunity for what it was. Sleep came easily that night, exhaustion and wine and emotional release combining to pull me under quickly. I dreamed of nothing memorable, waking Sunday morning to sunlight streaming through the windows and the quiet hum of the city outside. The wedding felt already distant, compressed into memory with the odd quality that significant events often acquire when processed by sleep and subconscious sorting. I made coffee and sat at my desk, opening my laptop to find my inbox full of messages, several from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, all of them reaching out with congratulations about the Fortune article and various comments about the wedding. The attention felt surreal and slightly invasive, these people who'd shown no interest in my life suddenly wanting connection now that my success had become public knowledge. I responded to the messages that felt genuine and ignored the rest, protecting my energy for the work that actually mattered. Monday would bring Gregory Hartwell's detailed proposal, would require careful analysis and consideration of potential candidates, would demand the focus and strategic thinking that made Bennett Capital Partners successful. But today, Sunday, belonged to rest and recovery, to processing what had happened and preparing for whatever came next. I spent the afternoon reading, catching up on industry publications and research reports, letting my mind engage with problems that had clear solutions and measurable outcomes. As evening approached and the sun dropped toward the Olympics, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, I felt ready for the next phase of whatever story I was living. The following weeks would prove transformative in ways I couldn't predict from the relative calm of that Sunday evening. Gregory Hartwell's proposal would arrive Monday morning as promised, comprehensive and professional, outlining an opportunity that would challenge Bennett Capital Partners in exactly the ways we needed to continue growing. The executive search would consume significant time and resources, requiring me to leverage every connection and instinct I developed over years of work. But beyond the business implications, something else had shifted. The wedding had forced a reckoning with family dynamics I'd been avoiding, had brought into sharp focus the conditional nature of their acceptance, had clarified that seeking their approval was ultimately a losing proposition. That clarity, uncomfortable as it was, felt liberating in ways I was only beginning to understand. Trevor never directly addressed the wedding confrontation, though I heard through family channels that he'd been noticeably subdued in the days following the reception. My parents sent an email thanking me for attending and mentioning that several people had spoken highly of me, their pride now apparently established enough to warrant acknowledgement. Christopher and Jessica sent a handwritten thank you note that included a genuine invitation to dinner once they returned from their honeymoon, a gesture that felt authentically warm rather than obligatory. The various responses revealed the spectrum of relationships within my family, from Trevor's resentment to Christopher's genuine goodwill, from my parents' conditional acceptance to the broader family's sudden interest in the success they'd previously ignored. What mattered most, though, was my own understanding of where I stood. The Fortune article had made my success public, Gregory Hartwell had validated it in social terms my family could understand, and Trevor's failed attempt at humiliation had backfired spectacularly. But none of that external validation changed the fundamental reality. I'd built Bennett Capital Partners through years of focused work, strategic decisions, and absolute commitment to a vision others had dismissed. The recognition was satisfying, but it was peripheral to the actual achievement. I'd learned over that wedding weekend that real worth was internal, proven through action rather than acclaim, measured by outcomes rather than opinions. Everything else was commentary, sometimes supportive, sometimes hostile, but ultimately irrelevant to the core question of whether I'd built something meaningful. The proposal from Gregory Hartwell arrived at precisely 9 o'clock Monday morning, delivered as a comprehensive PDF that demonstrated the kind of thoroughness I'd come to expect from successful business leaders. I sat at my desk with coffee steaming beside my laptop, the Seattle morning gray and misty beyond my windows, and began reading through the 40-page document that outlined Hartwell Manufacturing's vision for their aerospace division. The detail was impressive: market analysis supporting their expansion strategy, financial projections that appeared conservative rather than optimistic, organizational charts showing where the new division president would fit within their existing structure. Gregory had done his homework, anticipating the questions I'd ask and providing answers before I needed to formulate them. This wasn't a casual inquiry or a speculative reach. This was a carefully considered strategic move by a company that understood exactly what they needed and had identified Bennett Capital Partners as the solution. I forwarded the document to Rachel with a note asking her to begin preliminary candidate research, then called James to discuss the opportunity in detail. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the energy of someone already several hours into their workday. "Tell me this is about the Hartwell engagement because I've been thinking about it all weekend." I confirmed and spent the next 30 minutes walking him through the specifics, describing the scope of what Gregory was requesting, the timeline they were working within, the compensation package they were prepared to offer the right executive. James listened with the focused attention he brought to significant opportunities, occasionally interrupting with questions that cut to the heart of potential challenges. His conclusion matched my own initial assessment. "This is substantial, Marcus. If we place the right person and the aerospace division performs according to their projections, it positions us for follow-on work with their expanded operations. Plus, success here gives us credibility in the manufacturing sector we haven't had before." The strategic implications extended beyond this single engagement, opening pathways into industries where Bennett Capital Partners had limited presence. Our portfolio leaned heavily toward technology and healthcare, sectors where our network was deep and our track record strong. Manufacturing represented a different ecosystem, one where executive needs and success metrics followed patterns we understood conceptually, but hadn't worked within directly. Gregory Hartwell's engagement offered an entry point, a chance to prove our methodology translated across industries, to demonstrate that our approach to leadership placement wasn't sector-specific, but rather based on fundamental principles of matching capability to opportunity. The potential excited me in ways I hadn't felt about a project in months, the combination of challenge and strategic importance, activating the part of my brain that had driven me to start Bennett Capital Partners in the first place. Rachel's preliminary research arrived by early afternoon, a spreadsheet listing 17 potential candidates who met the basic criteria Gregory had outlined. Each name came with abbreviated notes about their background, current position, and why they might be suitable for consideration. I reviewed the list carefully, immediately eliminating 6 candidates whose experience was either too narrow or too disconnected from the specific challenges Hartwell Manufacturing would face. That left 11 possibilities, a manageable number to research more deeply, to reach out to through back channels, to evaluate not just for technical qualifications but for cultural fit and leadership philosophy. The process would take weeks, required discretion to avoid alerting competitors or creating unnecessary market noise, demanded the kind of patient systematic investigation that separated effective executive placement from simple resume matching. Over the following days, I immersed myself in the search with an intensity that surprised even me. Mornings began with, Research, reading through industry publications and trade journals, tracking career movements and company performance metrics, building a detailed picture of the aerospace manufacturing landscape. Afternoons involve conversations, careful outreach to contacts who might know candidates personally, informal discussions with executives who weren't themselves possibilities but could provide insights into who was. Rachel coordinated the logistics, scheduling meetings and managing information flow, her organizational precision ensuring nothing fell through the cracks. James handled our existing portfolio, freeing me to focus almost exclusively on the Hartwell engagement, recognizing that success here could reshape Bennett Capital Partners' trajectory in significant ways. The search narrowed gradually, 17 candidates becoming 11, then 7, then 4 finalists who warranted serious consideration. Each brought different strengths and potential drawbacks, different leadership styles and track records. I scheduled calls with Gregory to discuss each candidate in detail, walking him through not just their qualifications, but my assessment of how they'd approach the challenges his aerospace division would face. These conversations revealed depths to Gregory's thinking I hadn't fully appreciated during our wedding reception discussion. He asked questions that probed not just capability but character, wanted to understand not just what executives had achieved, but how they'd achieved it, cared deeply about building an organizational culture that aligned with Hartwell Manufacturing's values while pushing into new territory. His thoughtfulness reminded me why I'd been drawn to this work in the first place. The opportunity to solve complex human puzzles that had profound business implications. During this intensive period, my family receded into background noise, their presence in my life reduced to occasional text messages and forwarded emails. My mother sent an article about venture capital trends with a note saying she'd been reading more about my industry, an effort that felt genuine even if belated. My father called once to mention that several colleagues had asked about Bennett Capital Partners, his tone suggesting pride mixed with lingering uncertainty about whether my success was sustainable or temporary. Trevor remained silent, his absence speaking louder than any attempted reconciliation could have. Christopher and Jessica returned from their honeymoon and sent that promised dinner invitation, suggesting a date 3 weeks out when their schedules settled. I accepted, appreciating their consistency, their willingness to maintain connection without the complicated weight that characterized my relationships with other family members. The turning point in the Hartwell search came during a video call with the third finalist, a woman named Catherine Reeves who'd spent 15 years rising through the ranks at a major aerospace contractor, before leaving to run operations at a smaller advanced materials company. Her background was technically impressive, hitting every requirement Gregory had outlined, but what struck me during our conversation was something less quantifiable. She talked about leadership with a philosophical depth that suggested years of reflection, describing her role not as commanding subordinates, but as creating conditions where talented people could do their best work. When I asked about her approach to entering a new organization, she spoke about listening before acting, about understanding existing culture before attempting to reshape it, about the importance of early wins that built credibility without alienating established teams. Everything about her responses suggested someone who'd thought deeply about executive leadership, who understood that technical expertise was necessary but insufficient, who recognized that transforming organizations required patience and strategic thinking as much as bold vision. I called Gregory immediately after the conversation ended, catching him as he was leaving his office for the day. "I think we've found your division president. Catherine Reeves checks every box on your requirements and brings something additional that's harder to define but crucial. She understands organizational dynamics at a level most executives never reach." He listened as I walked him through the specifics of our conversation, asking clarifying questions, pushing back on points where he wanted deeper understanding. By the end of our call, he'd agreed to a formal interview, pending Catherine's interest in the opportunity. That interest proved easy to secure. When I outlined the role and Hartwell Manufacturing's plans during our follow-up conversation, Catherine's enthusiasm was immediate and genuine. "This is exactly the kind of challenge I've been looking for," she said, her voice carrying excitement that hadn't been present during our initial discussion. Building something new within an established company, bringing aerospace expertise to a manufacturing operation ready to expand, having leadership support at the ownership level, those are rare alignments. The formal interview process stretched over 2 weeks, multiple meetings between Catherine and Gregory, facility tours where she could see Hartwell Manufacturing's existing operations, conversations with key team members who'd be reporting to her or collaborating with the new division. I stayed involved throughout, facilitating introductions and providing context, ensuring both parties had the information they needed to make informed decisions. The process moved with a momentum that suggested genuine fit, each interaction strengthening, rather than undermining the initial positive impressions. When Gregory finally called to confirm he wanted to extend an offer, his voice carried satisfaction that went beyond simply filling a position. "Marcus, this is exactly what I'd hoped for when I first tried to reach your firm. Catherine isn't just qualified. She's the right person for this specific opportunity at this specific time. That's the distinction I was looking for." We negotiated terms over the following week, Catherine's attorney reviewing the employment agreement, Bennett Capital Partners' fee structure being finalized, various details about start date and relocation and equity compensation being resolved. The process was professional and relatively smooth, both parties approaching negotiations with good faith and reasonable expectations. When everything was signed and Catherine accepted the position, I felt a satisfaction that extended beyond the successful completion of a search. We'd proven that our methodology worked outside our usual sectors, that the principles underlying Bennett Capital Partners' approach to executive placement translated across industries, that careful systematic investigation combined with strategic thinking could solve complex leadership challenges, regardless of the specific business context. Gregory insisted on taking me to dinner to celebrate the placement, choosing a restaurant in downtown Seattle that overlooked the waterfront, the kind of establishment where business deals were sealed and relationships were built over excellent food and better wine. We met on a Thursday evening, the city glowing in that particular way Seattle has during autumn when the air is crisp and the lights seem sharper against darkening skies. Over appetizers, we discussed Catherine's transition plan, her ideas for building the aerospace division team, the timeline for beginning operations. But as the evening progressed and wine relaxed our conversation, the discussion shifted toward more personal territory. Gregory talked about building Hartwell Manufacturing from a small regional supplier into a company with national reach, the sacrifices that growth had required, the moments of doubt when success seemed impossible. His candor surprised me, this successful businessman revealing vulnerabilities and uncertainties that rarely surfaced in professional contexts. I found myself reciprocating, talking about starting Bennett Capital Partners with minimal capital and maximum conviction, about the years when every month felt like a test of whether the firm would survive, about the isolation of building something unconventional while family and friends questioned my judgment. Gregory listened with the focused attention that characterized all his interactions, occasionally asking questions that revealed he understood not just the business challenges, but the emotional complexity of entrepreneurship. "You know what impressed me most about you at Christopher's wedding?" he said during a pause in the conversation. "It wasn't the Fortune article or your firm's track record, though those are certainly impressive. It was how you handled your cousin's contempt with dignity instead of anger. That kind of composure under pressure tells me more about someone's character than any professional achievement." His observation touched something I hadn't fully processed about that evening, the decision to meet Trevor's insult with calm rather than defensiveness, to let the moment speak for itself rather than engaging in the kind of petty combat my cousin had been seeking. I'd made that choice instinctively, drawing on years of learning that the best response to dismissal was often no response at all, letting outcomes speak louder than arguments. But hearing Gregory name it as a strength rather than weakness reframed the entire interaction, suggested that the composure I'd developed through necessity had become something more valuable, a leadership quality that served me beyond simple conflict avoidance. We finished dinner with espresso and a shared dessert, the conversation ranging across topics from industry trends to family dynamics to the challenges of maintaining integrity in business environments that often rewarded expedience over principle. When we finally left the restaurant and stood on the sidewalk in cool autumn air, Gregory shook my hand with warmth that transcended professional courtesy. "This has been the beginning of something valuable, Marcus. I hope we'll have opportunities to work together again in the future." The weeks following Catherine's placement brought a shift in how Bennett Capital Partners was perceived within Seattle's business community. Word spread about the successful Hartwell Manufacturing engagement, the story taking on mythological qualities as it passed through various networks and conversations. The narrative people told emphasized Gregory Hartwell's public recognition of my worth at the wedding, Trevor's humiliation, the dramatic arc from family disappointment to professional validation. I found the simplified version both amusing and frustrating, the way complex reality had been compressed into an easily digestible story about underdogs and vindication. But I couldn't deny the practical benefits. Our phone started ringing with inquiries from manufacturing companies and industrial operations that had previously seemed beyond our reach, executives in those sectors expressing interest in being part of our network, investors asking about opportunities to participate in our fund. Rachel hired 2 additional researchers to handle the increased workflow, both of them young and hungry and eager to learn the systematic approach we developed. James spent more time on strategic planning, analyzing how we could scale without losing the careful attention to fit and culture that made our placements successful. I found myself in the unusual position of having to turn down opportunities, recognizing that growth for its own sake would undermine the very qualities that had made Bennett Capital Partners effective. We remained selective, taking engagements only when we believed we could genuinely add value, maintaining the standards that had defined us from the beginning. The discipline felt right even as it meant passing on lucrative opportunities, staying true to principles that mattered more than short-term revenue. My family's response to these developments evolved gradually, moving from surprise to something approaching genuine pride. My mother started calling more frequently, asking questions about specific deals that had been covered in business publications, showing interest that seemed authentic rather than performative. My father invited me to speak at a professional development event his firm was hosting, introducing me with a warmth I hadn't heard in years. The shift felt both validating and bittersweet, confirmation that their recognition had always been possible but had required external validation they could understand and measure. I accepted their renewed attention with caution, appreciating the improvement while remaining aware that the fundamental dynamic hadn't changed. Their pride was still conditional, still dependent on markers of success they deemed legitimate, still rooted more in how my achievements reflected on them than in genuine understanding of the work itself. Christopher and Jessica's dinner invitation materialized 6 weeks after their wedding, a casual evening at their new apartment in Capitol Hill where we ate takeout Thai food and talked about everything except business. Christopher asked about the Hartwell engagement with genuine curiosity, wanting to understand the process of executive placement, interested in the strategic thinking behind matching leaders to opportunities. Jessica shared stories from her new position at a nonprofit arts organization, her enthusiasm infectious as she described programs they were developing. The evening felt easy in a way family gatherings rarely did for me, free from the competitive undercurrents and unspoken judgments that characterized larger Bennett family events. As I drove home that night, I realized that this kind of relationship, modest and genuine and unencumbered by complicated history, was what family connection could look like when both parties approached it with good faith and reasonable expectations. The holiday season arrived with its usual demands and obligations, the Bennett family planning their traditional Thanksgiving gathering at my parents' Bellevue home. My mother called 3 weeks in advance to confirm my attendance, her voice carrying a hopefulness that suggested she recognized how easily I could decline. I agreed to attend, motivated partly by genuine desire to see Christopher and the few relatives I actually enjoyed, partly by curiosity about how the family dynamics would play out now that my success was undeniable even by their measures. The gathering itself proved less awkward than I'd feared. Relatives treating me with a respect that hadn't existed at previous events, conversations focusing on Bennett Capital Partners' recent successes, people asking questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Trevor remained cordially distant, offering a brief greeting but avoiding extended interaction, his pride apparently still wounded enough to prevent reconciliation. The most significant moment came late in the evening, after most guests had left and only immediate family remained. My father asked me to join him in his study, the wood-paneled room where he'd delivered so many lectures about responsibility and proper life choices over the years. I followed him with some trepidation, uncertain what this private conversation would reveal. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon and handed me one, gesturing toward the leather chairs positioned near his desk. "I owe you an apology," he began without preamble, his directness catching me off guard. "I spent years telling you that your path was wrong, that you were making mistakes, that you should choose something more conventional. I was wrong, and more importantly, I was dismissive of your judgment and vision in ways that damaged our relationship. I'm sorry for that." The apology landed with surprising weight, its sincerity evident in his posture and tone. I'd imagined various scenarios for how my father might eventually acknowledge his misjudgment, but I'd never expected something this direct and unequivocal. I accepted the apology carefully, not wanting to diminish it but also not willing to pretend the years of dismissal hadn't left marks. What matters is where we go from here. I'd like to have a relationship that isn't contingent on whether my choices align with your expectations. He nodded slowly, taking a sip of bourbon before responding. I'd like that too. And I'd like to understand your work better. Not just the outcomes but the thinking behind it. If you're willing to share that occasionally, I'd appreciate the opportunity to learn. The conversation continued for another hour, ranging across topics we'd never discussed openly, touching on regrets and missed opportunities, acknowledging the ways we'd both contributed to the distance between us. It wasn't a complete healing, years of accumulated hurt couldn't dissolve in a single conversation, but it was a beginning, a foundation on which something more substantial might eventually be built. Winter settled over Seattle with the gray persistent rain that defined the season, the city becoming softer and more intimate in the reduced light. Bennett Capital Partners continued its trajectory, new engagements flowing from the visibility the Hartwell placement had generated, our portfolio companies performing well enough to generate strong returns for investors. Rachel's team had grown to 5 researchers. James was exploring opportunities to launch a second fund focused specifically on growth stage companies, and I found myself spending more time on strategic planning than on individual deals. The shift felt natural, the evolution of a founder's role as an organization matured, but it also created space to think about what I wanted Bennett Capital Partners to become beyond simply successful. We'd proven we could identify promising companies and place effective leaders. The question now was what larger impact we wanted to have, what legacy we hoped to build beyond financial returns and professional recognition. I spent long evenings at my desk considering these questions, looking out at Seattle's lights and thinking about purpose and meaning, and whether success measured purely in monetary terms was ultimately satisfying. The Fortune article and wedding confrontation felt increasingly distant, compressed into memory with the odd quality that significant events acquire once their immediate intensity fades. What remained was the fundamental understanding I'd gained through those experiences, the clarity about who I was and what mattered and how I wanted to move through the world. My worth wasn't contingent on family approval or public recognition or external validation of any kind. It existed in the work itself, in the companies transformed through strategic leadership, in the executives whose careers flourished because we'd connected them with the right opportunities, in the portfolio companies that succeeded because we'd provided not just capital but strategic guidance at crucial moments. Catherine Reeves sent an email in late December, updating me on her first months at Hartwell Manufacturing, and thanking me again for connecting her with the opportunity. The aerospace division was coming together faster than projected, she wrote. The team she'd assembled was exceeding expectations, and Gregory's support had been everything she'd hoped for. Reading her words brought the satisfaction that came from knowing a placement had worked exactly as intended, that careful investigation and strategic thinking had produced outcomes that benefited everyone involved. This was what Bennett Capital Partners existed to create. These moments where the right person in the right position at the right time generated value that rippled outward in expanding circles. Everything else, the recognition and the revenue and the reputation, was simply byproduct of doing this core work well. The year ended quietly, no dramatic events or major announcements, just the steady accumulation of small successes and incremental progress that characterized sustainable growth. On New Year's Eve, I stood at my window overlooking Seattle as fireworks began their sporadic displays across the city, brief flowers of light blooming and fading against the darkness. My phone buzzed with messages from friends and colleagues, from Christopher wishing me well, from my mother hoping the new year would bring continued success, from James proposing an ambitious growth strategy for the firm. I responded to each message thoughtfully, appreciating the connections while remaining grounded in my own understanding of what mattered. The new year would bring new challenges and opportunities, new portfolio companies to support and new executives to place, new chances to prove that Bennett Capital Partners' methodology created genuine value. But the fundamental work would remain unchanged: the patient systematic investigation, the strategic thinking about fit and culture, the commitment to matching capability with opportunity in ways that transformed organizations. Looking back at everything that had happened since the Fortune article appeared, since Trevor called me a loser at Christopher's wedding, Since Gregory Hartwell had intervened with words that shifted the entire family narrative, I recognized that none of it had changed who I actually was or what I'd built. The external validation had been satisfying in the moment. The public recognition of worth that my family had long denied felt like vindication of choices they'd questioned for years. But the deeper truth was simpler and more profound. I'd built Bennett Capital Partners because I believed in a particular approach to venture capital and executive placement, because I saw patterns others missed, because I had the vision and conviction to pursue something unconventional despite skepticism and doubt. The success that followed came from staying true to that vision, from refusing to compromise core principles for easier paths, from trusting my own judgment even when it contradicted the advice of people whose opinions I'd been raised to respect. My family's belated pride was welcome but ultimately peripheral to that central reality. They'd come to understand my worth through external markers they could measure and validate, through magazine articles and public praise from people like Gregory Hartwell whose status they recognized. But I'd understood my own worth years earlier, in the quiet accumulation of successful placements and strong portfolio returns, in the grateful messages from executives whose careers had flourished, in the knowledge that I was building something meaningful that would outlast any single article or moment of public recognition. That understanding, earned through years of patient work and absolute commitment to excellence, was the real foundation of everything Bennett Capital Partners had become. The rest was just noise, sometimes pleasant, sometimes validating, but ultimately irrelevant to the core question of whether I'd built something that mattered. As midnight approached and the fireworks intensified across Seattle's skyline, I raised a glass of champagne to the window, toasting the city that had given me space to become exactly who I was meant to be. The new year stretched ahead full of unknown challenges and opportunities, but I faced it with a clarity and confidence that felt hard-won and entirely earned. My worth had never been in question except to people whose opinions ultimately didn't matter. The real validation had come from the work itself, from the steady demonstration that vision combined with discipline could create outcomes that changed lives and transformed organizations. Everything else, all the public recognition and family acknowledgement and social validation, was just confirmation of what I'd already proven to myself through years of focused effort and unwavering commitment to excellence. And that knowledge, private and unshakable, was worth more than any headline or any moment of public vindication could ever be. The spring that followed brought changes to Bennett Capital Partners that extended beyond simple growth metrics or portfolio performance. We'd moved into larger offices in South Lake Union, occupying an entire floor with views that stretched from Lake Union to the downtown skyline. The expanded space necessary to accommodate the team that had doubled in size over 6 months. The new environment felt different from our original scrappy operation, more professional and established, carrying the weight of expectations that came with success. I found myself navigating a different set of challenges now, less about proving our methodology worked and more about maintaining the culture and standards that had made us effective as we scaled. Rachel had been promoted to partner, her equity stake in the firm reflecting the irreplaceable value she brought to our executive placement process. James and I had long conversations about sustainable growth, about how to expand without diluting the careful attention to fit that characterized our best work, about whether we should remain deliberately small and selective, or embrace the momentum pushing us toward becoming a larger operation. The Hartwell manufacturing engagement had opened doors we'd only theoretically considered before: manufacturing and industrial companies seeking our services, executives from traditional sectors wanting to join our network. Catherine Reeves had become an informal ambassador for our work, speaking publicly about how the placement process had connected her with an opportunity perfectly aligned with her capabilities and ambitions. Her aerospace division was exceeding projections, generating revenue that validated Gregory's expansion strategy, creating jobs and economic activity that rippled through the regional economy. When I visited their facility in late March for a progress review, walking through clean modern manufacturing spaces where skilled workers assembled complex aerospace components, I felt a satisfaction that transcended financial returns. This was real impact, tangible value creation that employed people and built products and contributed to industries that mattered. Our role had been relatively small, identifying and placing the right leader, but that seemingly minor intervention had unlocked substantial outcomes that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Gregory pulled me aside during that facility visit, guiding me toward a quieter conference room away from the production floor noise. He'd been working on something, he explained, a broader initiative that might interest Bennett Capital Partners. Hartwell Manufacturing was considering acquisitions, smaller companies with complementary capabilities that could be integrated into their operations. But he didn't want to simply buy companies and absorb them. He wanted to identify operations with strong fundamentals but weak leadership, acquire them strategically, and transform them through executive talent similar to what we'd done with Catherine. The vision was ambitious, essentially creating a systematic approach to industrial consolidation driven by leadership transformation rather than traditional cost synergies. Would Bennett Capital Partners consider partnering on something like that, providing the executive talent component, while Hartwell Manufacturing handled acquisition and operational integration? The proposal was unlike anything we'd done before, requiring capabilities we'd need to develop, demanding a level of commitment that would reshape our business model in significant ways. I told Gregory the first needed time to consider the implications, to discuss with James and Rachel whether this aligned with where we wanted Bennett Capital Partners to go. The conversation occupied my mind during the drive back to Seattle, the proposal's potential competing with concerns about overextension and mission drift. We'd built our reputation on careful selective work, taking engagements only when we believed we could genuinely add value, maintaining standards that prioritize quality over volume. Gregory's vision would require scale and speed we'd never attempted, would push us into operational territory beyond pure executive placement, would test whether our methodology could work under different constraints and pressures. But it also represented exactly the kind of systematic transformation opportunity that had motivated me to start the firm initially, the chance to prove that strategic leadership placement could reshape entire industries rather than just individual companies. The partnership discussion with James and Rachel stretched over multiple meetings, each of us bringing different perspectives and concerns. James saw enormous financial potential, the opportunity to participate in value creation at a scale we'd never accessed through traditional venture capital. Rachel worried about operational complexity, questioning whether we had the infrastructure to support multiple simultaneous searches while maintaining our quality standards. I found myself torn between excitement about the strategic possibilities and caution about taking on commitments that might compromise what made Bennett Capital Partners effective. We brought in an outside consultant who specialized in professional services firm growth, seeking perspective untainted by our own proximity to the decision. Her analysis was thoughtful and nuanced, identifying both substantial opportunities and legitimate risks, ultimately concluding that success would depend on whether we could build systems that preserved our core methodology while operating at greater scale. After 6 weeks of analysis and discussion, we decided to pursue a modified version of Gregory's proposal, committing to partner on 3 pilot acquisitions over 18 months. The limited scope would let us test the model, develop necessary capabilities, and assess whether this direction aligned with our strengths and values before committing to something larger. Gregory accepted the phased approach, appreciating our caution and the strategic thinking behind starting small. We formalized the arrangement through a detailed partnership agreement that outlined responsibilities, compensation structures, and decision-making processes. The legal work consumed weeks, attorneys on both sides negotiating terms that protected their clients while enabling genuine collaboration. When we finally signed the agreement in late May, I felt both excitement and trepidation, aware that we'd committed to something that would either prove transformative or reveal limitations we hadn't anticipated. My family's presence in my life had settled into a new equilibrium during these months, relationships that felt more authentic than they had in years, but still carried the weight of complicated history. My father and I had lunch monthly now, conversations that ranged beyond business into more personal territory, slowly building the kind of connection that had been absent since I'd left for college. My mother had started attending some of Bennett Capital Partners' public events, sitting in audiences when I spoke at conferences, her presence feeling supportive rather than evaluative. Christopher and Jessica had become genuine friends, the 4 of us occasionally joining James and his wife for dinners where business talk was explicitly banned in favor of discussions about books and travel, and the challenges of maintaining relationships amid demanding careers. Even Trevor had attempted reconciliation of sorts, sending an email 6 months after the wedding that acknowledged his behavior had been inappropriate, and expressed hope we could move past the tension. I'd responded briefly, accepting the apology without committing to deeper reconnection, content to let time and consistent positive interactions gradually rebuild whatever relationship was possible. The first acquisition target under our partnership with Hartwell Manufacturing emerged in June, a small precision machining company in Oregon that produced components for medical device manufacturers. The company had solid customer relationships and quality products, but had struggled financially due to leadership problems, the founder's children having taken over management without the necessary skills or experience. Gregory's team had identified the opportunity and negotiated acquisition terms, leaving Bennett Capital Partners responsible for finding an operations executive who could stabilize the situation and position the company for growth. The search proved more challenging than I'd anticipated, requiring someone with both technical manufacturing expertise and the interpersonal skills to navigate a family business transition, capable of implementing needed changes while respecting the legacy the founder had built. Rachel's team identified 12 potential candidates initially, but after detailed investigation, only 3 seemed genuinely suited for the unique challenges this situation presented. The eventual placement was a man named Robert Chun, a manufacturing executive who'd spent his career turning around struggling operations, someone who combined technical competence with unusual emotional intelligence and a track record of successful family business transitions. His interview process with Gregory and the Oregon company's existing team went exceptionally well, everyone recognizing that he understood both the operational challenges and the human dynamics that would determine success. Robert accepted the position in late July and began work immediately, diving into the company's operations with systematic thoroughness. I visited the Oregon facility a month into his tenure, walking the production floor with him as he explained changes he was implementing, improvements to workflow and quality control, investments in equipment that would expand capabilities. His assessment of the situation was precise and his strategy sound, giving me confidence that this first test of our partnership model would succeed. The summer brought an unexpected invitation, a request to speak at a national venture capital conference in San Francisco about Bennett Capital Partners' approach to executive placement. The organizers had read the Fortune article and followed our subsequent work, recognizing that our methodology represented something different from traditional venture capital practices. I accepted the invitation despite some reluctance about public speaking, recognizing that sharing our approach might inspire others and potentially raise the overall quality of how venture capital firms thought about leadership. The preparation for the talk consumed evenings and weekends, distilling years of practice and intuition into a coherent framework that could be communicated clearly. I worked through multiple drafts, testing versions on James and Rachel, refining until the content felt both accessible and substantial. The actual presentation took place in late August, delivered to an audience of several hundred venture capitalists and entrepreneurs in a hotel ballroom overlooking San Francisco Bay. Standing on that stage, looking out at faces illuminated by presentation slides, I felt a surreal awareness of how far Bennett Capital Partners had come from our origins in a shared office space with minimal capital and maximum conviction. The talk went well, the audience engaged and asking thoughtful questions afterward, several prominent investors approaching to discuss how they might implement similar practices within their own firms. But what struck me most during that conference wasn't the professional validation or the networking opportunities. It was the realization that we'd built something genuinely influential, that our work was shaping how other investors thought about the relationship between leadership and success, that the methodology I developed through years of trial and error was now being studied and adapted by people I respected. The recognition felt different from the Fortune article or the wedding confrontation with Trevor, less about personal vindication and more about professional impact, the satisfaction of knowing our work mattered beyond our own portfolio and partnerships. The flight back to Seattle gave me time to process the conference experience, to think about what it meant for Bennett Capital Partners to be recognized not just as successful but as innovative, as contributing new thinking to how venture capital worked. I'd never sought that kind of influence, had built the firm simply to practice what I believed was a better approach to investing and supporting companies. But influence had emerged naturally from consistent excellence, from staying true to principles even when they required more work than conventional approaches, from producing results that spoke louder than any marketing or self-promotion ever could. As the plane descended toward Seattle-Tacoma Airport in Seattle appeared below, I felt grateful for the path that had led here, for the struggles that had taught me resilience, for the family disappointment that had freed me to pursue my own vision, for every challenge that had forced me to become someone capable of building something meaningful. Autumn arrived with its characteristic Seattle transformation, the city becoming softer and more contemplative as rain returned and daylight shortened. The Oregon acquisition was performing ahead of projections, Robert Chen's leadership having stabilized operations and positioned the company for growth that would benefit both the employees and Hartwell Manufacturing's broader strategy. Gregory was already identifying the second acquisition target, energized by the initial success and increasingly confident that the partnership model would work at scale. Rachel's team had grown to accommodate the increased workload, 7 researchers now working under her direction, each of them trained in the systematic investigation methodology that made our placements effective. James was deep in fundraising for our second fund, meetings with institutional investors who'd watched our track record and wanted participation in future opportunities. The firm's momentum felt sustainable now rather than precarious, built on foundations solid enough to support continued growth without threatening the core values that defined us. My parents hosted Thanksgiving again that year, the gathering smaller than previous years but more genuinely warm. Family members who actually wanted to be there rather than attending from obligation. Christopher announced that he and Jessica were expecting their first child, news that brought authentic joy and excited discussion about names and nursery plans. Trevor attended with his fiancée, a woman I'd never met who seemed kind and grounded, someone whose presence appeared to soften some of his sharper edges. He and I had a brief conversation that felt almost normal, discussing nothing of substance but managing civility without tension. Evidence that time and maturity were slowly healing old wounds. As I drove home that evening, full of good food and tired from hours of family interaction, I felt something I hadn't experienced at a Bennett gathering in years. Genuine belonging, the sense that I was accepted not despite my unconventional path but because of it, valued for who I'd become rather than judged for who I wasn't. The year's end brought the usual accounting and analysis, measuring returns and assessing portfolio performance, evaluating what had worked and what needed adjustment. Bennett Capital Partners had posted our strongest year yet, both in financial returns and in less quantifiable measures of impact and influence. The Hartwell partnership was proving successful beyond initial expectations, our placement methodology translating effectively to the acquisition context Gregory had envisioned. The team we'd built was functioning well, culture remaining strong despite the growth that often diluted organizational values. And personally, I'd found a kind of peace with my family that I'd stopped believing was possible, relationships that felt authentic rather than performative, connection based on mutual respect rather than conditional approval. On New Year's Eve, I found myself at the same window where I'd stood 12 months earlier, watching fireworks bloom across Seattle's skyline, reflecting on how much had changed while the fundamentals remained constant. The work still mattered most, the careful matching of executive talent to organizational opportunity, the patient investigation that preceded every placement, the commitment to excellence that defined Bennett Capital Partners regardless of external recognition or financial success. My worth still derived from that work rather than from how others perceived it, from knowing I was building something meaningful that would outlast any individual achievement or moment of validation. But I'd learned over the past year that accepting recognition didn't diminish that internal foundation, that letting family relationships heal didn't require compromising the independence that had enabled my success, that influence and impact could coexist with the humility and selectivity that made our work effective. These weren't contradictions but rather a more mature understanding of how to move through the world, how to remain true to core principles while engaging with the messy reality of human relationships and professional reputation. Midnight approached and the city prepared to welcome another year. I thought about Trevor's wedding reception insult and Gregory Hartwell's intervention, about the Fortune article and my father's apology, about all the moments over the past 18 months that had tested and ultimately strengthened my understanding of who I was and what I'd built. The story people told about that wedding night had taken on mythological qualities, the dramatic arc of underdog vindication appealing to something fundamental in how we understand success and worth. But the real story was quieter and more complex, less about a single moment of public recognition, and more about the steady accumulation of choices and work that had made that moment possible. I'd built Bennett Capital Partners not to prove my family wrong, but because I believed in a particular approach to venture capital, and had the courage to pursue it despite skepticism and doubt. The validation that followed, from Fortune and Gregory Hartwell and eventually from my own family, was satisfying but secondary to the fundamental achievement of staying true to my vision. The new year would bring new challenges and opportunities, the second and third Hartwell acquisitions, continued growth of our team and portfolio, probably additional recognition and influence as our methodology spread through the venture capital community. But none of that would change what mattered most. The work itself, the patient systematic investigation, the strategic thinking about leadership and organizational fit, the commitment to excellence that had defined Bennett Capital Partners from the beginning. My worth had never been in question except to people whose opinions ultimately didn't matter. And now, standing at this window overlooking a city that had given me space to become exactly who I was meant to be, I understood that the real victory wasn't in proving them wrong, but in building something so substantial that their opinions became irrelevant. That knowledge, hard-won and unshakable, was the foundation everything else was built on. The truth that made all the recognition and reconciliation possible without being dependent on any of it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.